I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling, written to be performed aloud and then recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD is an ongoing story, but you don't need to start from the beginning. You can and should jump in with this or any other episode. And then afterward, you can find out what you've missed with the previous episodes of the podcast or the prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 48. The tears burned Maul's face. They stung his big, wide eyes. They seared his skin as they slid down to his cheeks, and they scalded him to his very core. Before, in his wild sobbing, his uncontrollable, agonized weeping, they dropped from his face and fell down to the battered, broken, departed beast that he knelt beside. Skog. Skog. His Skog. She had been with him for most of his life. She had been the only one who stood by him, who didn't abandon him, who never betrayed him, who always stayed true. And now she was nothing more than a pile of bones, of flesh, of ragged fur, rent and torn by nescient, ignorant hands. Trolls. They had scattered when Maul approached. They were stupid and they were hungry, but they were neither stupid nor hungry enough to stand against Maul, that rampaging savage who, upon seeing Skog, upon seeing his pet, his companion, his friend, his only friend, had rushed to her, letting loose a guttural scream, a primal cry that let all those present not just know, but feel the indescribable, unfathomable depths of his all-consuming misery. He paid the trolls no mind. Even if they had stood against him, even if they made to defend their gruesome meal, it would have made no difference. Maul would have done nothing differently. He would have ignored the trolls as he rushed to Skog. He would have shrugged off their attacks as he knelt by her side. In that moment, he would have allowed them to take him, allowed them to beat him, to batter him, to infect him or devour him. He would have allowed anything. He would have allowed every indignity if a single one held any chance of reuniting him with her, with Skog. Even if it were to be within that inky black void of nothingness. He knelt beside her, overcome with grief, his body racked by the shakes and spasms that are only ever experienced by those cursed with loss, with true loss. His mind, that shattered, broken landscape, that tortured psyche, was smothered by the dull, heavy blanket of mourning, the one that robs food of flavor, takes sound from harmony, and makes the entire world lifeless and gray. But as he cried, as he marveled at the sound of his weeping, a sound he had thought lost alongside his stolen childhood, his mind began to fight back against the storms that ravaged it. And he remembered. Frantically, he dug at the inner pockets of his worn, filthy leathers. He reached inside and he found the sprig. The new growth, the sprout of the world tree that had forced its way up out of his cudgel, nourished by blood, by gore, and by viscera, coaxed out through violence and hate. The sprigs, A single one of them had healed him, had knitted his broken body back together, had saved him from what would have been certain death in the ravine, and in his wisdom, Maul had known better than to waste one, had known better than to simply give one to that bestial monk, to Xylan, and instead he had kept it, had held on to it, hidden and guarded. He had saved that new growth. Skog was motionless, breathless, lifeless. She was a battered, ruined mess of fur and bone and flesh, a dim reflection of the noble, majestic beast that she once was, a terrible mockery of the vitality of life, one that made Maul's heart ache so badly that he wanted nothing more than to turn away, to bury his face in his hands, to weep and wait for it, to wait for the inky black void of nothingness to come and overtake him. No, he couldn't just wait. He couldn't simply sit by and do nothing. His pet, his companion, his friend, his Skog needed him as she had needed him in his youth, stranded, orphaned, the last of her kind, needed him as he needed her in his captivity, stranded, orphaned, the last of his kind. They knew one another. They understood one another. They were one another. They were the same. And without her, Maul had to act. So he took the sprig in one hand, then used the other to pry open Skog's mouth, his body racked with another wave of spasms and fits as he realized just how gone Skog was, when even those once mighty jaws were left limp and lifeless. But Maul would not be deterred. He would not be discouraged. He had come so far. He had done so much. He had done things he shuddered to think of, and he would not give up now. So he placed the sprig in the mouth of that massive, motionless, torn and ruined cat beast. He placed the sprig in Skog's mouth. He did his best to grind it between her teeth, those massive, gleaming daggers. And he waited. With bated breath, struggling to choke down the whimpering, pitiful cry that bubbled up in his throat, the one emitted by the boy, the frightened child he thought that he had left behind so long ago. He waited to see Skog twitch and shiver, to see her raise her head, to feel a surge of relief rush through his limbs, to bask in the feeling of a triumph that was as magnificent as it was, in hindsight, inevitable. He waited to hear Skog mewl as she did when she was a kitten, waited to hear her purr as she would when she curled up at the base of his throne, waited to hear her roar as she rose and stood by his side, ready to cut down all those that opposed them. But all he heard was a surging, rising chant, a word that meant nothing to him, but nonetheless filled his broken, empty heart with dread. Kargan, Kargan, Kargan. As Maul knelt by that ruined corpse, that tattered carcass, his remaining companions, Caleria and Xylan, rushed, panting, to his side. Caleria stopped short. She had never laid eyes upon the cat beast Skog, but their mad dash through the tundra hadn't taken so much out of her that she couldn't piece things together. Maul, the brute, the savage, that awful oaf, sat staring ahead, not with rage or fury or hate or any of the other odious emotions that tended to inhabit his visage. No. He sat staring with big, wet eyes filled with something she recognized as being every bit as dangerous. Grief. She chose her words carefully, but quickly, as she knew that she tread upon dangerous ground, knew that she must tiptoe around that dangerous, explosive savage and do it fast, because the trolls, urged forward by that horrible, meaningless chant, closed in on them by the second. Maul. She spoke gently, but quickly. We have to move. The trolls. There's too many. Maul, nodding his head, but refusing to face the sorceress, keeping his eyes locked on SKALD's motionless form, mumbled his response. Just a moment. Just a moment. She's getting up. I know she is. I know she is. Caleria began to panic, unsure of both her ability to rouse the comatose Maul, as well as her ability to navigate the wasteland, to fight through the massing horde of trolls. Without him. Maul. No. No, she's not. We have to go. We have to. But before she could finish, Xylan. No, not Xylan. Not the sad, noble, godless monk of the day. This wasn't Xylan. This was the beast, the leering, giggling monster that possessed him, that gobbled up a little bit more of the monk every time it emerged from the darkness. That grinning scavenger leaned forward, and he spat, the bile falling thick from his lips. All of this, my king, for a beast? Maul had been taken by shock, handed over to grief, then held, a twisted dagger at his throat, wielded by a hollow hope for the impossible. But now, the savage was freed from that bondage. The hostage was liberated upon hearing the beast's voice. Xylan, that stupid, monstrous animal. He had one job. Maul had given him a single order, a sole command, and he had failed. Maul saw the world around him. The sorceress, the monk, the mass of churning green flesh that surrounded them, saw it slow to a crawl. Xylan had failed him. Had failed as king, and worst of all, worse than all of that, he had wasted their time, wasted his time, wasted all that was left of SKALD's time. That sweet, noble beast was gone, and it was because of him, because of Xylan's failure, because he felt compelled to rush across the tundra, because he chose to flee from his companions, from his king, all to do what? To do what? To tend to a lizard? Maul saw Caleria's eyes go wide as he moved toward that filthy, cackling beast. They had moved quicker. They had arrived sooner. If Xylan had done a better job doing his job, his only job, the job that Maul, his king, had commanded that he perform, they might have arrived in time. Maul shoved Caleria away, forcing the witch to the ground as she tried to block his path, to block the path of a king. And she was no better. She was no better than Xylan, the wicked, evil monk that laughed uncontrollably, even as his king lunged toward him with hands outstretched. If they hadn't needed to heal Xylan, they would have had time. They wouldn't have wasted a night in that cave, wouldn't have been injured by that monster. They would have arrived in time, and SKALD would still draw breath. No. They were both to blame. They had both failed him. They had killed Skog. They had murdered her. They had taken her from him, and they would both pay for their failure. They would both pay with the only thing that subjects have to give their king, the only thing that is theirs to give, the only thing that wasn't first given to them, the only thing that they don't simply use on loan from their king. They would pay with their lives. So Maul roared. He screamed. He shouted so loudly, so forcefully, that Xylan found himself stumbling backward even before Maul smashed into him. Maul grabbed the snarling, laughing scavenger beast by his throat, right at that exquisite spot, low enough to shut off the flow of air and high enough to avoid those snapping jaws. Bestial monk's head bounced off the rocks as they crashed into the ground. But though he was dazed, he was still a threat, as the monk's instincts didn't need a high-minded sentience to spring into action. Though Maul had chosen his target well, though he prevented the monster from biting him, Xylan's arms and legs were still free. Maul squeezed, bringing the full weight of his body to bear on the monk, as the witch, sobbing, weeping, crying like the cowardly child that she was, tried, in vain, to pull Maul off of her pet, never realizing that she only delayed the inevitable, delayed his death as well as her own, delayed not by minutes, but by seconds. As Maul squeezed, as he began to let out a terrible, hopeless, nihilistic cackle of his own, he felt the monk's claws, felt those wicked black talons rip and tear his flesh. But the pain only made him more determined, more powerful. The pain gave him the hate, the anger, the necessity that had always fueled his brutal race, an ancient lineage defined by combat. Maul roared and laughed and cried so hard, so manic, so intense that he didn't notice the fleshy green hands as he shook Xylan, shook that fading beast like a dog with his prey, as Maul rattled what life remained in him, urging the monk to give up what ghost still animated his feral flesh. He didn't notice the trolls, the ones that surrounded him, the ones that closed in, urged on by those incessant chants, the ones that bent down and took him up with those fleshy green hands. Hilarious screamed at Maul, at the trolls, at him for forsaking her once again. She cried and she fought to free herself, but to no avail, as the trolls pulled her away from Maul and lifted the sorceress up into the air. She kicked, she squirmed, and she tried desperately to free herself, but it was no use, because if one troll's hand slipped, there were two more ready to catch her, and if those two were stunned by her kicking feet, four more trampled over their bodies to take their place. It was no use. They had her. They had taken her, and there was nothing she could do about it. But though he was no longer assailed by her screams and pounding fists, Maul didn't even notice her absence. He didn't notice anything. He had eyes only for Xylan, for the godless, bestial monk, for the one who had failed him, and in doing so had condemned his friend, his only friend, to a gruesome, painful, lonely end. So now, it was his duty, his responsibility, his mission, his reason for being, to make sure that Xylan left the sundered worlds in a similar fashion. In pain, in misery, and in fear. as Maul gave Xylan his final command, his last royal decree, to die, to give up the ghost, to go stumbling into that inky black void of nothingness. He didn't notice that he too had been taken by the trolls. The savage, even in his battered, starved state, even hunched over, directing every ounce of his strength down to the powerful, calloused hands holding Xylan's throat shut, even then, he was a heavy burden to bear. And to carry Maul was to also shoulder the weight of that which the savage held, the wild, thrashing, dying beast that fought fruitlessly to escape the brute's clutches. They couldn't carry Maul as they did Caleria. They couldn't hoist him up and pass him through their numbers, so instead, they seized him. By his tattered, blood-stained leathers, by his thick, tangled hair, by the crooks of his joints, by his feet and toes, they grabbed him and dragged him through the tundra, over rocks, over stone, by the caves and the ridges, under the blackened sky and that heavy, full moon. Maul didn't know that he had been taken, couldn't know that he had been moved, because he was in the throes of violence, overcome with the ecstasy of destruction, the curse and the blessing that bound him to his ancestors. He didn't know anything until the trolls stopped, until they ceased dragging him, until they backed away, chanting, always chanting, over and over again, chanting that unknown but fearsome name, until they left Maul, that monumental brute, upon a broad, flattened expanse of stone, panting and grinning, clutching the battered corpse of a pitiable, emaciated monk. I should have burned you! I should have burned you when I had the chance! Caleria wept even as the trolls passed her over that shattered landscape, trying now not just to free herself, but to claw her way to that scowling, unrepentant murderer. Maul. You're a monster! You're a monster! Nothing but a monster! Maul cast Xylan's body to the ground. In his excitement, in his ecstasy, Maul must have bit his tongue. So when he spat, what hit the pallid face of the monk was a grisly blend, a crimson glob of blood thickened by his saliva. Oh, I'm a monster, witch. I'm a monster. But not just. I'm more than you realize, more than you can ever know. I am a warrior. I am a king. I am a destroy. But before Maul could finish, the air around him exploded. The chants had been omnipresent, growing steadily in volume and intensity, but suddenly the air itself shook with that monotonous, bloodthirsty cry. Kargan! 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 The trolls had erupted, their frenzied cry reaching a fever pitch, leaping and shouting, crying and tearing the meager rags they wore to clothe their vulgar nakedness. And as Maul turned, he saw the trolls part like a frothing sea of green to reveal that which they cheered on. The destroyer. Kargan. Maul, stupefied, gazed out at this destroyer, the one known as Kargan, the giant that lumbered toward him. Far bigger than Maul, far stronger, far more muscular, far more imposing than even the Grollock, more fearsome than the stone giant he had brought to life in that border realm, because this was not some staggering pile of rocks. No, this was a man and then some. quickly. Maul's shock, his amazement, gave way to something far, far more useful. Rage. Because as Maul scanned this giant, as its crashing footsteps drew closer and closer, Maul began to see what lined his arms, his legs, his neck, and even his face, where one eye was covered by a filthy, blood-stained rag. They were gashes, cuts, lacerations, heavy wounds that could only come from a beast as vicious as it was majestic, as powerful as it was awe-inspiring. They could only come from one being, from his companion, from his friend. They could only come from SKALD. You killed her, Maul roared, bracing himself upon the rocks, splaying out his fingers in a dangerous readiness. You killed SKALD, you monster! The giant, that unbelievable conqueror, slowed his approach, grinning. No, not a monster, a destroyer. You. The giant looked Maul up and down, and though he was but a fraction of his size, he saw something fearsome and formidable, saw something that mattered deep within the savage, and then, his eye drawn lower, he saw something else. Maul's cudgel. You and your club, you will make for a fitting challenge. Maul shook his head. I don't need it. I don't need anything but your head between my hands, held aloft for heaven and hell alike to see. Kargan, delighted, pounded the earth with both fists, causing the trolls to erupt in cheers once again. Then so be it, though I hope for both our sakes you put up more of a fight than your pet. Come, challenge me! The giant, the destroyer, Kargan, was mere yards away, but in the time it took Maul to traverse that distance, he lived a lifetime. For the first time since finding her body, his mind left SKALD, left her alone in that inky black void of nothingness, and he reached out past the darkness, beneath the world around him, the world that had punished him endlessly, the world that held nothing but suffering within it. He reached down deep to where he knew he could find him. He reached down to his world, to the roiling underneath. Maul's feet pounded the rocks. His fists beat his chest. A rising battle cry filled his throat and then his ears. But that pounding, that beating, those cries were something else. They were a prayer. Though it pained him, though he hated himself for doing it, though thinking of what it had cost him and would cost him still made him shudder in terror, Maul prayed to him for aid, for assistance, for his unholy blessing. And he obliged. As Maul rushed toward the smiling giant, the hordes of trolls faded from the periphery. The giant himself melted into the endless sea of broken rocks, and Maul's vision filled with one thing and one thing only. That smile. The smile That awful, hideous, rictus grin. It opened wide and swallowed that dying world whole. It blanketed Maul's shattered mind and filled in the gaps of his ruined psyche. And in that moment, in that immeasurable instant, Kargan's expression soured because he too saw that smile, that rictus grin, saw it plastered upon the terrible, howling face that charged toward him. That smile stretching across his face, with that grin causing his cheeks to ache and his jaws to crack, Maul understood. For the first time, he truly understood. The violence, the pain, the destruction, the death, the blood, the gore, and the horror. It wasn't that. But it wasn't just that. It was something else, something worse, something far more terrible and potent. It was worship. It was his worship. It was worship of him. Xylan, that broken failure of a man, had been right. There are no gods. But that doesn't mean there wasn't something else, something more base, something more primal, something that even those fictional deities must obey. And now Maul understood. And finally, he too would obey. Maul crashed into Kargan, surprising the giant with his speed, his strength, and most of all, his ferocity. The savage, the brute, the oaf, the king, the one true king of men, struggled with the giant, locked hands with that massive, looming figure, and embarked upon a fool's errand as he attempted to overpower a giant, to match strength with a destroyer, to fight and struggle against Kargan. Maul knew he couldn't beat him. Not alone. So he screamed. He opened that rictus grin. He allowed his jaw to unhinge as he, a single man, a king, let loose a scream that drowned out the entirety of the trolls' chants. A horrible cry that was heard by Kargan, the trolls, Caleria, the few remaining bestial inhabitants of that world, and most importantly, by him. As Maul began to feel himself waver, to feel his strength give out. As his arms ached, his knees shook, and his heart pounded nearly out of his chest from exertion. As he saw Kargan take back up his smile, as he leaned on his challenger, forcing the one true king of men down toward the ground. Suddenly, Maul heard a response. Heard the answer to his prayer, heard a voice that sounded like thorns and ashes. I knew you would. Maul felt his muscles fill with vitality, felt the surge of a dark, atavistic power as it filled his body. He felt his blessing upon him, felt him give Maul that which he had always wished to bestow. He felt that precious gift, all that he had ever wanted for him. He felt it and he relished it. He honored it, he protected it, and he prized it above all else, because what else remained in his life? He accepted the gift. Accepted the blessing. He accepted the strength to fight back and stand tall as the world around him burnt to cinders. Maul began to laugh because he had finally accepted his blessing, accepted the truth of things, accepted the omnipresence of that roiling underneath and that which it contained, that which it represented and nourished. He laughed so hard that he couldn't breathe, but he didn't need to breathe, because coursing within him was that eldritch energy, the unavoidable, undeniable law and necessity that informed all of creation and its inevitable destruction. Maul fought back. He stood tall, he held his ground, and Kargan was stunned, amazed, confused, and terrified. How could he, a giant, the destroyer, how could Kargan be unable to overpower this insect, this worm, this mere man? But he couldn't. Though victory had been within his grasp not a moment before, now Maul could not be defeated, could never be defeated, not while giving himself over to the roiling underneath, to his true master. So Maul fought back. He stood tall, holding the giant at bay, standing motionless though Kargan brought his entire prodigious strength to bear upon him. He held the giant in place, held him until he heard his joints crack, heard his bones splinter and his muscles tear, until those sickening noises were joined abruptly by the cracking of something else. The rocks that filled that broken world, the rubble that littered the landscape, the hulking boulders that defined the tundra. They'd begun to crack, to crumble, and shatter. Beneath Maul's very feet, he saw it happen, saw the ground tear and yawn open, split asunder. By wood. By snaking, ever-growing lengths of fresh, living wood, split apart. By roots. The ground began to give way, began to shift under their very feet, but still, Maul and Kargan did not release their hold, could not release their hold upon one another. But Maul, puzzled, confused, and furious, turned and looked over his shoulder, turned and looked back, and he was left astonished. Because behind him, where he had knelt crying mere moments before, where he had experienced a purer, more complete loss than he had ever imagined, rising up out of the broken, torn, bloodied, and ruined carcass of his pet, of Skog, of his Skog, was a tree. A massive tree, a hulking ash, the likes of which he had seen but once before. The World Tree. Nourished by Skog's body, by Maul's hate, by his misery, or some combination of the three, the tree had burst forth from the single sprig that held it. And it had sent its thirsty, undeniable roots crashing through the rotten foundation of that dying world. The trolls screamed and ran. But in their terror, they tripped, they fell, they pushed one another down into the gaping chasms that began to open up across that broken tundra. Because as the roots tore apart that world, as they broke that rocky earth into gravel, what remained, what was underneath, was naught but stars and the blackness of the heavens. Kargan saw what was happening. Saw the inescapable ruin being visited upon his world, and for the first time in his life, he knew fear, knew true fear, not the fear of disappearing, not the fear of not mattering, but a fear that exists in the hearts of all men, a fear that drives and forces back, a fear that can be postponed, but never denied. In his fear, in his panic, Kargan tried to turn, tried to run, tried to escape. But he found himself held by the small, grinning monster at his feet, the one that held his hands tightly even as the ground beneath them opened up into a nightmarish expanse of pure emptiness, into a terrifying, sucking vacuum. Though the earth cracked beneath their feet, though that dying world finally met its end, Maul refused to let go of that terrified, screeching giant, refused to let go of the destroyer, refused to let go of Kargan. And as his cowardly opponent struggled, As he squirmed, as he tried anything to get away, Maul tightened his grip. He wrapped his arms tightly around the giant's thick, corded, shaking neck, holding him in place as the world split and fell apart all around him. And as he did so, the savage, the brute, the oaf, the king, the one true king of men, leaned in, and with that impossibly wide rictus grin, he whispered something unpronounceable, unspeakable, unbearable, something profane that turned Kargan's cries into squeals. Maul held the giant, that terrified, squealing pig, the one that knew he was to be slaughtered, thought he could escape it, but knew that he couldn't. Maul held him. He saw the roots move faster beneath his feet, saw them split the rocks to rubble. He felt the ground give way, felt his feet kick against nothing but blackness, felt his stomach sink as they fell, and his heart rise as he learned the truth, as he accepted the truth, that which was always meant to be. He would have what he was owed. He would take what was his. He would do what he must, as he always had. He would burn this world and every other to cinders. He would stand proudly in the wreckage, the king, the one true king of men, the one true king of flame and ashes, and he would laugh. He would laugh as he laughed now, as he had laughed then, and as he would always laugh, happy, victorious, triumphant. In the darkness, I hope you're enjoying SKALD. This show is made possible only through the generosity of people like you. SKALD listeners who have decided to take the plunge and transition from mere fans to patrons. They donate small monthly dollar amounts at patreon.com/SKALD. Patreon allows you to contribute whatever you think is appropriate for this weekly 30-plus minute show, whether it's $1 or $10. But for the extremely generous, I am happy to give out special rewards. One of those rewards is a shout-out, available at that $10 level, which just so happens to be what Bryce Pullen pledges to the show. Go follow him on Twitter, @PoorlyConveyed, and tell him thank you. It should come as no surprise that many SKALD fans are doing awesome creative work of their own, and Bryce is no different. Go check out his web series, Seeking Sublet, at seekingsublet.com. If you're interested in becoming a patron and supporting SKALD with a small monthly contribution, that address again is patreon.com/SKALD. Whether you sign up or not, I hope to hear from you soon on social media. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Snapchat. Or hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my upcoming Street Fighter G.I. Joe comic book, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. This week's recommendation is one of my absolute favorite bands, one that I very well may have mentioned before. But they have a new album out, so I have absolutely no reservations about plugging them once again. It's Conan. And their new album, Revengeance, is as brutal, heavy, and uncompromising as the band's name would have you expect. Listen to it loud. Really, really anger the neighbors loud. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.